the Archivist of Millbrook. I was 29 when I accepted the position of town archivist in Millbrook, Indiana. At the time, I framed it as a practical decision. I had just come out of a failed contract position with a private records digitization firm in Louisville. I needed steady work, something quiet, something that didn't involve client deadlines or politics. Millbrook advertised the job as temporary but renewable. The pay was modest. The hours were regular. The town was small enough that nothing ever seemed to happen there. Millbrook sits in a shallow bowl between wooded hills, the kind of place you can drive through without realizing you've entered it. One blinking traffic light, a grain elevator, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon. According to the sign on the county road, the population was 147. That number would become important later, though I didn't know it at the time. My daily routine was simple. I rented a room above a garage owned by a retired couple on the north edge of town. I walked to the courthouse every morning at 8. The building dated back to the 1890s, red brick, narrow windows, a clock tower that hadn't worked in years. My workspace was in the basement, 2 levels below the public offices, where decades of municipal records had been stored without a consistent system. For the first 2 weeks, the work was exactly what I expected. Birth certificates, death notices, property deeds, tax rolls. I logged box numbers, assigned dates, and scanned documents for digital backup. The basement smelled like paper rot and dust. The silence was complete. No cell reception, no windows, just fluorescent lights and shelves. The trigger event didn't feel dramatic when it happened. I was reorganizing a mislabeled shelving unit. Records from the mid-1980s that had been partially damaged in a flood. As I shifted a stack of folders, one slipped out and fell open on the table. The tab read, Census Discrepancy, 1986. That alone wasn't unusual. Census disputes happen. What caught my attention was that the folder wasn't an official county document. The paper stock was wrong. The labeling didn't match any internal system I'd seen. Inside were 32 handwritten pages, photocopies of what appeared to be private investigative notes. No letterhead, no signature. The handwriting varied, tight and measured on some pages, rushed and uneven on others. I read the first page standing up. By the third, I was sitting. The notes outlined a statistical pattern. Every 10 years, beginning in 1936, Millbrook's recorded population dropped by exactly 43 individuals. The investigator had ruled out deaths, relocations, military drafts, and incarceration. Utility accounts tied to those individuals vanished. School enrollment numbers adjusted without explanation. Entire households were removed from voter rolls with no corresponding death certificates. The language was clinical. Cross-references were cited. Page numbers from state archives were noted. Whoever wrote it understood record systems. At the bottom of the last page was a sentence that stayed with me. Absence here is not random. It is administered. I did what the procedure manual told me to do. I brought the folder upstairs to the town clerk. Diane had worked in that office longer than anyone else. She was in her 60s, always immaculately organized, the kind of person who remembered names from 40 years ago. I placed the folder on her desk and told her I'd found something misfiled. She didn't open it at first. She stared at the tab, then at me. When she finally did look through it, she didn't turn every page. She skimmed just enough to confirm what it was. Then she closed it and slid it back toward me. "You should leave that alone," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no curiosity either. It was delivered the way someone gives instructions during a fire drill, flat, practiced. I asked her if she knew who compiled it. She said no. I asked why it wasn't cataloged. She told me some things were kept for context and didn't need to be indexed. When I pressed further, she stood up and said the conversation was over. That was the first irregularity. The second came when I tried to log the folder into the archive system later that afternoon. The reference number it should have fallen under didn't exist. The database skipped from 1985 to 1987. No error message, just absence. Over the next week, I began pulling related records quietly: census summaries, school registries, property tax ledgers. Once I knew what to look for, the gaps became obvious. Family names that appeared exactly once and never again. Houses listed as occupied for decades that abruptly switched to vacant with no sale recorded. Births without subsequent school records. Deaths without burial permits. I started writing things down in a separate notebook. Dates, names, addresses. I noticed that many of the missing individuals lived within a 3-mile radius of the courthouse. Rural roots, isolated properties. The same surnames appeared in utility disconnections and zoning variances. The first hard evidence came in the form of a microfilm reel labeled State Audit, 1996. The local paper had run an article about irregularities in Millbrook's municipal finances. The article ended mid-sentence. The reel jumped to the next edition with no explanation. No follow-up articles existed. State audit records listed the case as resolved, but no findings were attached. When I requested the full audit file through the clerk's office, the request was delayed, then lost, then returned with several pages missing. Diane stopped making eye contact with me. That same week, the voicemails began. My phone would ring once, then stop. When I checked the messages, there was nothing but breathing. Slow. Measured. No background noise. My car was keyed while parked behind the courthouse, a single line down the driver's side. My landlord told me the lease wouldn't be renewed and wouldn't say why. Institutional resistance escalated quickly. The sheriff's office told me I needed permission to access certain boxes I'd already been working with. The mayor's office informed me that my contract might not be extended due to budget restructuring. When I tried to contact the state archives directly, my calls were redirected back to Millbrook. The silent dread peaked one night when I stayed late to scan documents before a scheduled systems update. It was after 9. The building was supposed to be empty. While working, I heard footsteps above me. Heavy. Deliberate, not the random settling noises of an old building. The steps crossed the floor directly over my position and stopped. I turned off my desk lamp and sat in the dark. I didn't hear anyone leave. After several minutes, the basement door opened. I didn't wait to see who it was. I climbed out through a ground-level window and drove straight to the state police barracks in the next county. I gave a recorded statement. I turned over copies of my notes and the scanned documents I'd managed to back up. The officer told me they would look into it. 3 days later, federal agents arrived in Millbrook. The response was larger than anything I expected. The mayor's office, the police station, 12 private residences. Boxes of records were removed, computers seized. According to what I was later told, they uncovered a long-running human trafficking operation that used Millbrook as a transit and processing point. Records were falsified, identities erased. People moved through quietly. 43 individuals every decade, a quota tied to off-ledger funding streams and regional criminal networks. 7 officials were arrested. Others resigned. Diane was found dead in her home 2 weeks later. The ruling was suicide. No note. In the aftermath, Millbrook's population sign was taken down. It was replaced months later with a new number, lower. No explanation given. I left Indiana shortly after giving federal testimony. I don't work in archives anymore, but I still think about those names, the ones that appeared once and vanished. The records say the operation ended. Officially, it's closed, but every 10 years I check the census updates. And I still count. The Mercy Ward. I was working as a medical courier in rural Nebraska in 2009. It wasn't a dramatic job. I moved lab samples, intake files, radiology discs, sealed containers, barcodes, chain of custody forms. The routes were predictable: clinics, outpatient centers, a few long-term care facilities. Mostly cornfields in between. You learned the back roads. You learned which places liked you to knock and which didn't care. Nothing ever happened. That summer, my supervisor added a new stop to my route: St. Jude's Behavioral Facility, 40 minutes outside a town called Ashford, population just under 3,000. No hospital, no police department big enough to have its own building, just a sheriff's office attached to the courthouse. St. Jude's had been there since the 1950s. That's what the intake sheet said. Behavioral health, long-term psychiatric care, adult patients only. The building sat alone at the end of a gravel road, surrounded on all sides by cornfields that went right up to the tree line. No neighboring farms, no houses, no signage until you were almost on top of it. The first time I drove up, I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful, empty, no birds, no insects. Just wind through corn and the crunch of gravel under my tires. Inside, everything smelled old. Disinfectant layered over something damp and metallic. My contact was a nurse named Roland. That was all he ever gave me. No last name, late 40s, maybe older, pale, thinning hair. He never smiled, never asked about the weather. He signed for the samples and turned away. This went on for weeks. Same routine, same silence. In late August, as I was leaving, Roland stopped me at the door. "You ever hear anything while you're here?" he said, not looking at me. "Anything unusual? Don't talk about it. Not to anyone." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "Just don't," he said. 2 weeks later, I arrived late. Traffic on the highway had backed up. The sun was already low, turning the fields orange. I parked, grabbed the cooler, and went inside. The front desk was empty. That wasn't normal. There was always at least one attendant. I called out. No answer. The lights were on, the building was unlocked. I walked past the desk and into the main corridor. That's when I heard the singing. Children's voices. Soft. A lullaby. I stopped walking. I remember checking my phone, thinking maybe someone had left a radio on. But it wasn't distorted, it echoed. Multiple voices, out of sync. Like they were in different rooms but singing the same song. St. Jude's didn't have children. Every manifest I'd ever handled said adult psychiatric. I followed the sound. The corridor narrowed. Doors changed, thicker, reinforced. Small wire mesh windows sat high. At the end of the hall was a locked door with a faded sign. Mercy Ward. Authorized personnel only. The singing was coming from behind it. I pressed my ear to the door. It stopped. Not faded, stopped. And something on the other side pressed back. Not a knock. Pressure. Like a body leaning into the door. I stepped back hard, almost dropped the cooler. I turned around to leave. Roland was standing behind me. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he said. I demanded an explanation. My hands were shaking. He stared at me for a long time, then unlocked a nearby office and gestured for me to sit. "They did experiments here," he said finally. "In the 60s, electroshock, sensory deprivation, psychosurgery, kids, mostly wards of the state, no families, no records anyone would come looking for. I told him that was 50 years ago. Yeah, he said, but they never left. He wouldn't say more. He signed my paperwork and told me to go. I reported it. First to my supervisor, then to the county health department, then the state medical board. Every call went the same way. Polite listening, long pauses, promises to look into it. Nothing happened. Ashford had old money, farming families. A state senator whose name was on a wing of St. Jude's. The facility's licensing paperwork was immaculate. Inspections always passed. I started paying attention. Dates on file folders that didn't line up. Patient IDs reused. A sub-basement on the blueprint that didn't match the physical layout I'd seen. Security camera feeds that skipped hours at a time. One night, on my way out, I noticed a light on in the basement level. Officially, there was no patient care below ground. I didn't go back down there. 6 months later, a janitor did. He was replacing pipe insulation when he found a wall that sounded hollow. Behind it was a crawl space. Behind that, 12 small graves, shallow, unmarked. Forensics dated them between 1961 and 1967. Children, 6 to 14 years old. Signs of surgical intervention. No death certificates on file. The facility was shut down within a week. 4 current staff members were arrested. Obstruction. Evidence tampering, destroying records. None of them had worked there during the original experiments. The doctors responsible were already dead. Federal investigators sealed the Mercy ward. Most of the files were classified. Some were missing entirely. St. Jude's still stands. Empty now. The road is overgrown. The sign is gone. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that lullaby. And I know some places don't let go. The third shift. I took the third shift job because it was quiet, and because Harrow, Wyoming, didn't ask questions. I'd moved there after a separation, looking for work that didn't require explaining myself. The truck stop off Highway 34 sat a half-mile east of town, a low concrete building with a fuel canopy and a gravel lot that swallowed sound. Nights were predictable. Stock shelves run the register. Mop the same 3 aisles. Watch the digital clock tick forward while the prairie pressed in. Between midnight and dawn, I'd see 5 or 6 customers. Long-haul drivers buying coffee and jerky. A local ranch hand once or twice a week. A state trooper on patrol, usually around 2:30 a.m., who nodded but never stayed. The radio behind the counter picked up one station if the wind was right. Otherwise, it was static. The first time I noticed the man was the second week of February. The door chimed at 3:17 a.m. He walked in wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots that looked clean but old. He didn't glance at the counter. He didn't slow down. He walked the aisles, snacks, auto fluids, refrigerated case, then turned and left 10 minutes later. No purchase, no words. The second night, it happened again. Same time, same clothes, same path through the store. I told myself it was a routine. Truckers are creatures of habit. By the 4th night, I started watching the clock. The trigger came when I mentioned him to my manager, Denise, during a shift change. I asked casually, like it was nothing. "Hey, who's the guy who comes in every night at 3:17 and doesn't buy anything?" She stopped counting the till. Her hands froze. She didn't look up. "Don't talk to him," she said. "Don't look at him. Just let him do his thing and leave." I laughed. She didn't. Her face had drained of color. When I asked what she meant, she closed the drawer and said the schedule had changed and she had to go. She left without finishing the deposit. That was the first irregularity. The truck stop sat alone on a stretch of a highway with nothing but scrubland and windbreaks. At night, the prairie absorbs light. Headlights appear miles away and then vanish behind the building. The quiet is complete enough that you notice when it changes. Over the next week, I kept a log in a notebook behind the counter. Time of entry, duration, route through the store. Every night, 3:17 a.m., 10 minutes. He never blinked. His footsteps made no sound on the tile. Under the fluorescent lights, his shadow lagged by a fraction, like it belonged to someone else. I asked a local deputy about him when he stopped in for coffee. I described the clothes, the time, the behavior. He said, probably just a night walker, and changed the subject. When I pressed, he said the truck stop had had complaints before and that it was nothing to worry about. Pattern recognition came when I pulled old incident reports from the binder under the counter. There were entries for shoplifting, fuel drive-offs, a fight in the lot in 2009. There were also notes in the margins, initials, dates, times. 3 entries circled in red, all at 3:17 a.m., spread across different years. No description, just no action. The first hard evidence wasn't dramatic. It was a camera check. After the man left one night, I rewound the security footage. The cameras covered the entrance, the aisles, the register. At 3:17 a.m., the door didn't open. The aisles were empty. The only thing on the screen was me, standing behind the counter, watching something move that wasn't there. My head tracked him. My eyes followed his path. I spoke once, lips moving, but there was no one in frame. I saved the clip to a thumb drive. When I showed it to Denise the next morning, she didn't watch it all the way through. She told me to delete it. When I refused, she said corporate had rules about copying footage. She said the cameras were old. She said I was tired. Institutional resistance came quietly. The next night, the camera system rebooted at 3:10 a.m. The timestamp reset. The radio went dead. The trooper didn't stop by. At 3:17, the man arrived anyway. That was the night I spoke to him. "Can I help you find something?" I said. My voice sounded wrong in the open space. He stopped, slowly turned, looked at me. His eyes didn't focus the way eyes do. They didn't settle. They passed through, like he was aligning with something behind me. "I'm looking for the road," he said. "The road?" I asked. "The one I was on before." Then he walked out. The door chimed. The lot was empty. I didn't sleep after that. I pulled county records at the library in town. Harrow kept its archives in a back room. I searched Highway 34 accidents. In 1983, a man named Aaron Cruz died half a mile from the truck stop. He worked third shift at a meatpacking plant. He fell asleep at the wheel and hit a concrete barrier. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. There was a photo clipped to the report. Flannel shirt, jeans, work boots. Escalation came with attention. A county official called the store and asked why I was accessing old records on company time. Denise stopped answering my questions. A pickup I didn't recognize idled across the highway during my shift, headlights off. The critical evidence surfaced when I found a second binder behind the manager's desk, mislabeled. Inside were handwritten notes going back decades, names, times. Do not engage. No report. Family notified. The same time circled over and over, 3:17. I took photos, I copied names. The life-threatening moment wasn't a chase, it was a lock. One night, after the man left, the back door wouldn't open. The lights flickered. The store went quiet in a way that pressed on my ears. I stood behind the counter watching the entrance, convinced he'd come back. He didn't. The door unlocked on its own 10 minutes later. I quit 2 days after that. I mailed the footage and photos to the state attorney's office and the highway patrol. A task force showed up a month later. They interviewed Denise. They took the binders. The cameras were replaced. The truck stop closed for renovations. Aftermath came in pieces. A local paper ran a brief about an internal review. No charges. Denise transferred. The county clerk retired. The truck stop reopened under new management. Third shift still runs. I drive past sometimes. At 3:17 a.m., the lights are on, the lot is empty, and the road keeps going. The Canvasser. I was working as a census canvasser in the summer of 2010. It wasn't a glamorous job. I was 24, recently out of school, taking a temporary federal contract because it paid steadily and kept me moving. My days followed a strict routine. Wake up early, review my assigned blocks, drive rural routes, knock on doors, ask questions, fill forms, move on. Most of my territory was in southern Missouri, near the edges of the Mark Twain National Forest. The towns were small, spread out, and quiet in the way places get when industries leave and never come back. Closed diners, empty schools, hand-painted signs advertising land for sale. People were polite but tired. Many were suspicious of anything federal, but they answered eventually. Nothing about the work felt dangerous. It felt procedural, boring even. That changed during my third week. The trigger came from a discrepancy in my route assignments. I was reviewing printed block maps one evening at the motel when I noticed a town name handwritten in the margin of an older map, Ember Creek. It wasn't on my official digital assignment, but the notation included a population count, 238, and a block number that fell just outside my scheduled area. I assumed it was a clerical oversight. Rural routes changed constantly. Some towns shrank below reporting thresholds. Some were merged administratively. I flagged it mentally and decided to ask my supervisor the next morning. Instead, I drove there first. The road into Ember Creek wasn't marked. No sign, no town limits. Just a narrow, cracked strip of asphalt branching off a county highway. Trees crowded close on both sides, their branches brushing my car. There were no mailboxes, no reflectors, no cell signal. I remember thinking I should turn around, but the road kept going, and I kept driving. After about 15 minutes, the trees opened into a clearing. The town was there, but it didn't look abandoned. It looked maintained. Every house was the same. Single story, faded blue siding, white shutters, stone walkway leading to the front door. No cars in driveways, no toys, no trash cans. It felt like a housing development built all at once and then frozen. There was no town center, no store, no church, just houses arranged in neat rows. I parked near the first one and grabbed my clipboard. The man who answered the door was already smiling. He was mid-40s, average height, clean cut. He looked relieved to see me. Before I could introduce myself, he said, "Census?" I nodded. "Yes, Come in," he said. "We've been waiting." That phrasing caught me off guard. It felt rehearsed, but I stepped inside anyway. I'd been invited into hundreds of homes. This wasn't unusual. The interior was immaculate. Not tidy, sterile. The furniture looked unused. There were no photos, no decorations, no signs of daily life, no mail, no smell. Just a table, chairs, and a couch arranged like a showroom. He called out, "Honey, the census is here." A woman appeared from a hallway. Same age range, same smile, same posture. They sat across from me at the kitchen table. They answered every question immediately. Names, ages, employment, birthplaces. Everything matched the format of the form perfectly. no hesitation, no clarification needed. It felt like reading from a script. When I asked how long they'd lived there, they both said, always. I followed up, and before that, their expressions didn't change. The woman said, there is no before. I finished the form quickly and left. At the second house, the same thing happened. Same paint, same layout, same answers. The third house was identical, down to the cadence of speech. By the fourth, I stopped asking follow-up questions. I was focused on leaving. I returned to my car and drove back the way I'd come. When I reached the county highway, I noticed the time. I had entered Ember Creek around 10:30 a.m. It was now after 4:30 p.m. My phone was dead. The gas gauge was near empty. I had no memory of spending 6 hours there. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day. She checked the system. Ember Creek wasn't listed. Not in 2010, not historically. No block number, no population record. She suggested I'd misread the map. I showed her the completed forms. They had names, addresses, signatures. She took them and said she'd look into it. That was the last I heard officially. Over the next week, I started noticing patterns. The names on the forms repeated phonetic structures. Different spellings, same sounds. Birth dates clustered within a narrow range. Employment listed as local or domestic, with no employers named. I tried returning to the road. I couldn't find it. I drove the same highway, took the same turns. The branch wasn't there. I filed a written incident report. 2 days later, a regional coordinator called me. He said the forms were invalid and instructed me to destroy my copies. He advised me not to pursue the matter further. I didn't comply. I scanned the documents and saved them. I also took photos of the handwritten map margin showing Ember Creek. When I attempted to upload them to the internal system, the files failed repeatedly. A week later, a man visited my motel room. He said he was from the Department of Commerce. He didn't show credentials. He asked me to sign a statement saying I had fabricated the entries. When I refused, my contract was terminated. After that, the calls started. Unknown numbers. No voice at first, just breathing. Occasionally, faint background noise, like a room with no echo. Once, I heard the phrase, "Are you here for the census?" I reported the calls to local police. They took a statement. No follow-up. Months later, I was contacted by a federal investigator reviewing census discrepancies in rural Missouri. I provided everything I had. He acknowledged Ember Creek appeared in a 1971 agricultural survey as a planned resettlement site. No further records existed. That investigator was reassigned shortly after. To this day, I still have the scanned forms. The signatures are real. The handwriting is consistent across dozens of households. The population count matches the original margin note. I don't know what Ember Creek was. I don't know where it went, but I know it was waiting. And I know it noticed when I left. The last call came 3 months ago. I didn't answer. The voicemail contained no words, just a pause. Then a faint voice, barely audible, asking the same question. Census? The wet wire. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. At the time, my life was small and orderly. I was a licensed electrician doing contract work across northeastern Pennsylvania. Schools, municipal buildings, old commercial properties. Places no one wanted to touch because the wiring was outdated and the budgets were tight. Merrick High was just another line item. Built in 1954, closed in 2003, reopened in 2007 after a private investment group bought it for pennies and promised a revitalized educational environment. I lived 40 minutes away. I woke up at 5, drank bad coffee, packed my tools, drove the same highways every morning. My concerns were permits, deadlines, and whether the existing conduit would crumble when I touched it. Nothing more. The work order said, electrical upgrade, partial rewire, basement access required. 3 weeks on site. The trigger event came as a phone call from the contracting firm. The previous electrician had quit halfway through. No explanation. They needed someone reliable. The pay was better than average, and there was a completion bonus. I accepted without hesitation. Merrick High sat just outside the town of Dunmore, surrounded by trees that had grown unchecked during the years it was closed. The parking lot was cracked. The building looked wrong for its surroundings. Too large, too flat, like it had been dropped there rather than built. No other structures nearby, no foot traffic. Just the school and the woods. From the first day, the place felt cold. Not metaphorically, physically. Even in July, the air inside never warmed. The hallways were long in a way that didn't match the exterior footprint. I checked the floor plans twice. I assumed renovations had altered internal walls. The staff was minimal. A principal, a vice principal, a secretary, and security. The students, about 300 of them, kept to themselves. I noticed they didn't linger in the hallways. Bells rang, classes changed, and the building emptied quickly, like everyone was trained to minimize time between rooms. Early irregularities were subtle, doors opening on their own, lights flickering only in certain corridors, water fountains with signs taped over them. Out of order, do not use. I asked a custodian about it. He shrugged and said plumbing issues. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The basement access was through a locked stairwell near the old gym. The principal had to unlock it for me. He didn't ask what I'd be doing down there. He just reminded me not to wander. The basement was unfinished concrete, low ceilings, exposed pipes. The boiler room hadn't been updated since the 1980s. That was where my work was focused, running new conduit, replacing breakers, upgrading grounding. That's when I noticed the wall. It didn't match the blueprints. The plans showed open space, utility storage. Instead, there was a section of newer cinder block, hastily painted to blend in. The mortar was different. The paint didn't quite match. Anyone who works construction learns to spot that kind of thing instinctively. I tapped it. Hollow. I pried it open using a flat bar. The blocks came away easier than they should have. Behind it was a room. 10 feet by 10 feet, no windows, no lights, chains bolted into the floor at 4 corners, a drain in the center. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, frantic, overlapping. Words carved into the concrete. Help us. They're still here, don't drink the water. This wasn't old graffiti, the edges were sharp, recent. I backed out and called the principal. He arrived within minutes, faster than I expected. He brought 2 security guards. He didn't ask what I'd found. He looked past me into the room and told me to pack my tools and leave immediately. He said my contract was terminated, no paperwork, no explanation. I went to the local police station that afternoon. I reported what I'd seen. They took my statement. They said they'd look into it. No follow-up, no request for photos, nothing. A week later, I received a call from a blocked number. A woman spoke quietly. She wouldn't give her name. She said she'd attended Merrick High in the 1970s. She asked if I'd found the room. She told me about a special program. Students pulled out of class, behavioral conditioning, detention that lasted days. She said some students never returned to class. Officially, they transferred. Unofficially, no one ever saw them again. She told me not to drink the water. That's when patterns began to form. I searched court records. In 1979, there was a lawsuit. Parents versus Merrick School District. Allegations of abuse, illegal detention, and unauthorized medical experimentation. The case was settled out of court. Records sealed. The district superintendent at the time later took a federal appointment. I found old staff directories, repeated names, administrators who rotated through other districts after Merrick closed the first time. One of them was now working in state-level education oversight. The first hard evidence I obtained was indirect. A retired maintenance worker agreed to speak with me off the record. He said there were areas of the building he was told never to enter. He said the basement drains connected to a separate line, not the municipal system. He said water tests were falsified during inspections. When I tried to access environmental records, requests were delayed. Files were missing. One official told me Merrick was outside their jurisdiction due to its private ownership status. Then the power went out at the school. Total failure. I got a call from the contracting firm. They said the school specifically requested me to return. They said it was urgent. I shouldn't have gone back. But I did. The basement was dark. The air smelled metallic. I made my way to the main breaker panel. The floor was wet. It wasn't water. It was blood, fresh, pooling on the concrete, dripping from conduit pipes overhead, slow, steady drops. No body, no signs of a struggle, just blood coming from inside the walls. I didn't investigate further. I left my tools. I ran. That night, I noticed a car idling outside my house. No plates visible. It left when I approached the window. 2 days later, a man claiming to represent the school's legal counsel contacted me. He suggested I sign a non-disclosure agreement. He mentioned potential liability if I continued making claims. I refused. 3 months later, Merrick High closed again. Official reason, structural issues. No mention of environmental hazards. No criminal investigation announced. There was a brief state inquiry. It went nowhere. The building remained standing. Fenced off. Private property. I still think about that room, about the words on the wall, about the water fountains taped shut. Some places don't just witness harm, they're designed for it. And when institutions protect themselves instead of the people inside them, whatever was buried doesn't stay buried. The school is quiet now, but it isn't empty, and no one ever explained where the blood came from. The listener. I worked the nights because they were predictable. In rural Tennessee, predictability is a kind of safety. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., my world narrowed to a console, a headset, and 4 towns stitched together by state routes and long stretches of dark. Combined population under 3,000. We handled drunk drivers who slid into ditches, couples who knew each other too well, elderly people who fell and waited by the phone. I knew most of the voices by name. I knew which calls were serious before the line even finished ringing. My routine didn't change for years. Clock in, check the overnight log, pour bad coffee, listen. That changed in October 2011. The first call came in at 2:17 a.m. The number flagged as a landline. When I answered, there was nothing on the other end. No background noise, no voice, just static. I waited through the protocol count, asked if anyone was there, then logged it as a hang-up. That happens. Lines misfire, people get scared and hang up. The next night, the same number called again. 2:22 a.m. Same static. This time, underneath it I heard breathing. Slow, shallow, like someone trying not to be heard. I ran the number through our system. It came back disconnected. The address attached to it was in Riverside, a town so small it barely qualified as one. An old farmhouse on the edge of county land, listed as abandoned since the late 90s. I flagged it for the sheriff. He glanced at the printout and shrugged. Said it was probably kids messing with an old line. Told me to log it and move on. But the calls didn't stop. Every night after that, between 2 and 3 a.m., the same number came in. Same static, same breathing. No voice. I started timing it. The breathing would last about 40 seconds before the line went dead. Always the same. Riverside didn't have many secrets, but it had patterns. Once I noticed the timing, I pulled old logs. The number had tried calling before. Dozens of times over the last 3 years. All overnight, all unanswered. Different dispatchers had logged it as a glitch or prank and moved on. I didn't. By the 4th night, I started to feel watched. Not in a dramatic way, just a pressure. When the call came in, the room seemed to close in. The other lines went quiet. Even the radio traffic slowed. I could hear my own breathing through the headset. On the 6th night, something changed. The static was still there, the breathing too. But beneath it, faint and broken, was a voice. "Help me." I froze. My training kicked in late. 911, what is your emergency? I asked. The voice came again, weaker. I'm still here. Who is this? I said. My hands were shaking. A pause. Then, in the ground. The line went dead. I documented everything, timestamps, exact phrasing. I called the sheriff again and insisted he listen to the recording. He did. His expression changed, but he didn't say much. Told me we'd check it out in the morning. We drove to Riverside after sunrise. The farmhouse sat back from the road, half hidden by trees. The roof had collapsed in places. Windows were broken and boarded over again, like someone couldn't decide whether to keep people out or invite them in. The yard was overgrown except for one area in the back where the dirt looked darker, recently turned. The sheriff said nothing. He called in a cadaver dog. The dog didn't hesitate. It went straight to that patch of ground and sat. They dug carefully. 6 feet down, they found a body. She was female, mid-20s. The medical examiner later confirmed she'd been buried alive. No signs of struggle on the surface. Whoever did it had planned it. Her name was Clara Downs. She'd been reported missing 3 years earlier. Last seen leaving a bar in Riverside with her ex-boyfriend. Her phone was buried with her. It was still on. The call log showed hundreds of outgoing calls, all to 911, over 3 years, all between 2 hours and 3 hours a.m., all unanswered, except mine. The sheriff went quiet after that, too quiet. He tried to keep the investigation contained. No press, no outside agencies. Said it was an open and shut case now that we had the body, but I kept asking questions. How did a disconnected landline route calls from a buried cell phone? Why hadn't the missing persons case been pushed harder? Why were there gaps in the evidence logs from the original report? I pulled what I could, old files, dispatch records. Clara's case had been mishandled from the start. Witness statements not followed up, phone pings ignored. Her ex-boyfriend questioned once and released. The sheriff at the time had signed off on it all. Same man who now told me to stop digging. When the arrest finally came, it was fast. Clara's ex confessed within a week, said he thought the dirt would muffle her screams, said he didn't know the phone would keep working. He didn't explain how. The county announced the case closed, but the calls didn't stop right away. For 2 weeks after the arrest, the number kept calling. Same time, same static. No breathing anymore, just silence, then nothing. An internal review followed. Quietly, files went missing. The sheriff retired early. The state stepped in and reopened several old cases tied to Riverside. Some were closed again without explanation. Others are still listed as inactive. I quit dispatch 6 months later. I couldn't sit in that room anymore. At night, the quiet felt wrong. Like something was waiting for me to answer. I still hear it sometimes, when the house is asleep and the world slows down. Static, breathing, and a voice, faint but patient, asking if I heard it. I did. I'm not sure anyone else ever really did. The exit. I was a highway maintenance supervisor for the Idaho Transportation Department, assigned to a 60-mile stretch of Route 52 in the northern Panhandle. It wasn't a job that attracted attention. Most days were inspections, paperwork, and coordinating snow removal or pavement repairs. The road cut through dense forest and low mountain ridges. Traffic was light outside of hunting season. There were long sections where you could drive 10 minutes without seeing another vehicle. My routine was consistent. I lived alone in a rented house near the county line. I left before dawn, drove the full stretch once, noted any issues, then spent the afternoon filing reports or dispatching crews. I knew every mile marker, every culvert, every turnout. On that road, nothing appeared without someone approving it, logging it, budgeting for it. The first complaints came in early spring of 2008. Calls from drivers reported an unmarked exit near mile marker 47. They said it didn't show up on GPS units. It wasn't listed on state maps. Some claimed they took it by mistake and ended up lost for hours. At first, I assumed confusion. Old logging roads sometimes intersected the highway at odd angles. People misremembered details all the time, but the calls kept coming. A trucker said his route log showed an unexplained 20-mile detour. A couple from Spokane said they followed an exit that felt wrong and turned back. One caller said his brother took the exit and never rejoined the highway where expected. That was the trigger that forced me to look into it formally. I pulled the engineering schematics for Route 52. No exit was approved or constructed anywhere near mile marker 47. I checked maintenance logs, no paving crews, no budget line items, no subcontractors. A week later, I drove the route after dark, planning to confirm that the complaints were nothing more than driver error. I passed mile marker 46 without incident. As I approached 47, my headlights picked up fresh asphalt cutting cleanly away from the highway. A full-off ramp, proper grade, guardrails, reflective paint that looked new. No signage at all. I slowed but didn't stop. I remember checking my mirrors, half expecting another vehicle to confirm I wasn't imagining it. There was nothing behind me. Forest pressed in on both sides. The exit was unmistakable. I took it. The ramp curved into the trees and became a 2-lane road. The pavement was flawless. No frost cracks, no patching. It felt maintained at a level our department couldn't afford on main routes, let alone an undocumented spur. I drove for several miles without seeing a single marker or sign. My radio lost reception. The forest grew denser, the road unnaturally straight in places where terrain should have forced curves. Then the town appeared. It wasn't large, maybe 24 buildings. Residential houses, evenly spaced, a diner, a municipal-looking building with a flagpole. Streetlights cast a steady, bright glow that didn't flicker. The colors were sharp, almost overcorrected, like fresh paint that hadn't dulled yet. There were no vehicles parked anywhere. I stopped my truck near the diner. The engine noise seemed to vanish as soon as I shut it off. The air felt thick, charged, like standing too close to high-voltage equipment. There were no insects. No wind. I walked to the diner and pulled the door open. Inside, tables were set. Plates of food sat untouched. Coffee mugs were filled, steam still rising. A cash register was open with bills inside. No staff, no customers. That was the silent dread moment I still can't fully explain. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sense of being observed without any visible source. The kind of awareness that makes you keep your movements slow. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. A man stood in the doorway, middle-aged, clean-cut, wearing a suit that didn't fit the setting. He smiled in a way that suggested familiarity. "You're early," he said. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer directly. He said, "Most people don't come until they're ready." I backed away. He didn't move toward me. He didn't need to. There was no visible threat, and that was worse. I left the diner, got into my truck, and drove back the way I came without looking in the mirrors. The road felt longer on the return. When I reached Route 52, there was no exit ramp, no guardrails, just trees and shoulder. The next morning, I filed an incident report. State police followed up. They drove the route with me. There was nothing there. Aerial imagery showed uninterrupted forest. No construction records, no anomalies. 2 weeks later, a woman went missing near mile marker 47. Her car was found on the shoulder, engine running, driver's door open. No signs of a struggle. She was never located. That was when the investigation escalated. State authorities quietly contacted federal transportation auditors. Missing persons units reviewed similar disappearances along remote highways in neighboring states. I was interviewed twice more, once by a man who wouldn't give his agency affiliation. I provided what evidence I had: my maintenance logs, the complaints, timestamps from my vehicle's GPS showing a deviation that shouldn't have been possible. Others came forward. Drivers who described the same exit, the same town, the same sense of being expected. Institutional resistance followed. I was instructed to stop discussing the matter. My reports were reclassified. A supervisor told me I was misinterpreting data. I was reassigned off Route 52 within a month. Then came the confrontation. I was driving home late one night when I noticed a vehicle following me for over 20 miles without passing or turning off. When I slowed, it slowed. When I pulled into my driveway, it stopped at the end of the road and turned its lights off. No one approached. The message was clear. The critical evidence surfaced later, through channels I wasn't supposed to access. A federal transportation database flagged multiple ghost exits across rural highways nationwide, all near remote areas, all associated with missing persons cases. The files were incomplete. Many were sealed. Shortly after, a joint task force quietly shut down a number of unregistered roadway anomalies. Officially, the cases were listed as mapping errors, hoaxes, or driver confusion. No one ever explained the town. I left my job the following year. I don't drive long rural routes anymore. The task force claims the issue was resolved, but every so often, someone still goes missing near mile marker 47. And I know better than to assume the exit is gone. The Census Man. I worked as a data analyst for the U.S. Census Bureau, a position that rarely involved fieldwork and almost never involved anything that could be described as dangerous or emotionally charged. My days were spent in a secure office reviewing spreadsheets, reconciling population counts with infrastructure data, and flagging discrepancies that usually had mundane explanations. Rural areas often lagged behind reality due to seasonal migration, clerical errors, or outdated municipal boundaries. When something looked off, it was almost always resolved by a phone call to a county clerk or a minor database correction. In 2012, however, a file crossed my desk that didn't resolve. The town was called Stillwell, located in the northern part of Montana, several hours from the nearest regional hub. According to federal records, Stillwell had a stable population of 412 residents, a number that had not changed in over 2 decades. That alone wasn't unusual. Some towns plateau. What drew my attention was the satellite imagery. The most recent images showed a place that was clearly abandoned. Roofs were collapsed. Streets were cracked and overtaken by weeds. There were no vehicles, no visible maintenance, no signs of ongoing habitation. Utility usage data showed near zero consumption. Postal records indicated that mail service had been discontinued years earlier. School district maps showed no enrolled students within the census tract. Every external indicator suggested the town no longer existed as a living community, yet the official population count remained fixed and untouched. I ran the usual checks, assuming a data lag or an error in image sourcing. But the timestamps were current. The anomaly was escalated internally, and within 2 weeks I was instructed to perform an on-site verification. This wasn't framed as an investigation, just a confirmation. I was told to document occupancy, verify addresses, and file a standard field report. The drive took nearly 6 hours from the regional office, the last stretch on gravel roads that cut through forest and open land with no signage indicating a town ahead. Cell service dropped completely long before I reached my destination. When I arrived in Stillwell, it matched the imagery exactly. The town was silent, overgrown, and clearly abandoned. Buildings leaned inward from years of neglect. A gas station sat rusted with pumps locked in place. A schoolhouse had partially collapsed. There were no sounds of people, animals, or machinery. It felt less like a place people had left and more like a place time had stepped around. As I drove through the grid of streets, I noticed one anomaly. At the far edge of town, a single house had its lights on. The lawn was trimmed. The porch was intact. It looked lived in, deliberately so, as if maintained to contrast with everything else. I parked and approached, assuming this would be my confirmation of an error. I knocked, and the door opened almost immediately. The man who answered appeared to be in his late 60s, thin, pale, with eyes that were sharp and alert. He looked at me without surprise. Before I could introduce myself, he said, "You're here about the Count." I asked how he knew. He told me, calmly, that I was the 9th one they had sent. He invited me inside. The interior of the house was spotless, furnished in a style that suggested it hadn't been updated since the late 1970s. Plastic covers were still on the couch cushions. A record player spun in the corner, the needle down, but no sound came from it. A radio was on as well, tuned to static. The man told me his name, then stopped using it, referring to himself instead as the last one. He claimed that in 1978, the federal government had conducted a classified experiment in Stillwell. According to him, the goal was not demolition or relocation, but erasure. The idea was to determine whether a town could be removed from collective awareness without physically destroying it. He described a layered approach involving satellite manipulation, targeted radio frequencies, and psychological conditioning designed to interfere with memory formation and recall. Residents weren't forced out, he said. They simply forgot to stay. Jobs disappeared. Opportunities arose elsewhere. Families left one by one, unable to articulate why. Mail routes were quietly discontinued. Maps stopped printing the town's name. Stillwell faded because it was no longer noticed. He said he had been part of the project, a technician assigned to monitor persistence. When funding ended, the team was reassigned, files sealed, and the project forgotten. He was left behind. "They forgot me too," he said. I didn't fully believe him at the time. It sounded like the rationalization of someone who'd been isolated too long. I left the house and returned to my motel, intending to finish the verification the next morning. That night, I accessed internal census archives to prepare my report. I searched for previous field verifications related to Stillwell. There were 8, spanning from 1989 to 2009. Different analysts, different supervisors. Each report concluded the same thing. Town confirmed abandoned, no residents located. None of the reports resulted in a population update. The count remained 412. I looked closer. Each analyst's name was logged. Each report was time-stamped. Each analyst was reassigned or transferred within 3 months of filing. One had resigned entirely. No explanations were attached. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The next morning, I returned to Stillwell. The house was still occupied. The man let me in again without surprise. I asked him why the population count never changed if every report confirmed abandonment. He told me that changing the count would require someone to acknowledge that the experiment had worked. As long as the number stayed, the town existed on paper, and no one had to answer for its erasure. He showed me what he had been keeping. In a locked back room, there were boxes of documents, internal memos, technical diagrams, frequency charts, correspondence stamped with classification markings that no longer officially existed. Some documents referenced cognitive persistence failure and residual anchor subjects. He told me he was the anchor. As long as he remained, the count stayed. A statistical placeholder. Proof that Stillwell had not been fully erased. I photographed everything I could. When I returned to the regional office and submitted my findings, my supervisor did not open the files. I was told the case was being reassigned. Within a week, my system access was partially revoked. HR scheduled a performance review citing issues that had never been raised before. A bureau attorney contacted me and advised me not to retain copies of classified materials. 2 nights later, I noticed an unmarked vehicle parked across from my apartment. It left when I approached. I filed my report anyway. Weeks passed with no response. Then I received a call instructing me to return to Stillwell to verify the count again. I refused. I submitted my resignation the following day. 6 months later, I checked the public census data. Stillwell's population was still listed as 412. Before my access expired, I searched the internal archive one last time. My report was there. My name was now part of the record. The count had not changed. The Night Doctor. I was an emergency room nurse before I learned how quiet a hospital can get when it decides not to remember something. In 2013, I worked nights at a small hospital in rural West Virginia that served 5 counties and too many back roads. We were understaffed, underfunded, and permanently behind. Most nights followed a pattern. Chest pain after midnight, overdoses before dawn, car wrecks pulled off the mountain roads when the fog lifted just enough for someone to miss a curve. I knew the routine well enough to run it on muscle memory. I liked nights because administration slept. Fewer meetings, fewer questions, just work. The trigger came in late October, when the hospital announced we'd be getting a temporary night physician. HR said it was a stopgap measure. 6 weeks, maybe 8. His name was Dr. Kane. No first name on the schedule, just Kane. He arrived without ceremony, no orientation, no tour. He walked in before his first shift already, wearing scrubs that didn't match our colors. He shook hands once, briefly, and went straight to the charting station. From the beginning, he didn't fit the pace of the place. He never rushed, never hesitated. Trauma came in and he moved through it with an even, almost gentle efficiency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for repeats. He didn't miss anything. Patients loved him. Word spread fast in a small county. People asked for him by name. Some of them drove past closer hospitals to reach us on nights he was scheduled. What we noticed first was that he didn't get tired. 12-hour shifts didn't slow him. Consecutive nights didn't dull him. At 6:45 a.m., when the rest of us were counting minutes, he was still upright, still precise, still smiling. The hospital sat in a low valley, surrounded by wooded ridges that cut off cell service and radio signals. At night, the parking lot lights formed a weak island. Beyond that, it was just dark and trees. The early irregularities were small. He charted differently. He didn't use abbreviations we used. He added a line to certain cases that none of us recognized. Secondary protocol initiated. No explanation, no checkbox, just that phrase typed cleanly every time. When I asked another nurse about it, she shrugged and said, "Probably some research thing." Pattern recognition took longer. The first patient to come back was a man Dr. Caney had saved after a rollover accident on Route 16. He'd coded twice. We'd lost him for nearly 3 minutes. Caney brought him back without raising his voice. 3 weeks later, the man walked into the ER just before midnight, barefoot, bleeding from his scalp. He kept saying he'd been called back. He collapsed before triage and died on the floor. The second was a woman resuscitated after a stroke. Security found her standing at the edge of the parking lot at 1:12 a.m., staring at the building. When approached, she screamed and ran into the woods behind the hospital. We never found her. By the fourth incident, I started pulling charts. Every patient Dr. Caney had personally resuscitated had that same notation. Secondary protocol initiated. Dates, times, different diagnoses, same line. I printed copies and kept them in my locker. That was my first evidence cache. When I took my concerns to the charge nurse, she told me administration was aware. When I asked administration, they told me HR had cleared him and that outcomes spoke for themselves. When I asked HR for his file, they said it was handled through a staffing agency and not kept on site. Institutional resistance didn't look like anger. It looked like delays, like emails unanswered, like meetings rescheduled, like a quiet suggestion that I was burning out and maybe needed a few days off. The silent dread came on a night when the ER went empty all at once. No radio chatter, no monitors beeping, no HVAC hum. Just the fluorescent lights and the sound of my own breathing. I realized Dr. Kane wasn't at the desk. I found him in the morgue. There's a window in the morgue door. I watched through it. He stood alone over a body we'd pronounced earlier that evening, a man who'd died of a massive heart attack. Caney placed his hand flat on the man's chest. He didn't move his lips. The body convulsed, its eyes opened. It sat up. I didn't scream, I didn't move. I backed away until I hit the wall. When I ran, I didn't go home. I went straight to the county sheriff's office. I handed over the chart copies. I described what I'd seen. The deputy took notes without looking at me. He said they'd follow up. They did, 2 days later, with hospital administration present. They found nothing. No Dr. Kane on the schedule. No employment record. No staffing agency contract. The charts I'd printed were gone from the system. My copies were returned to me with a note that they were unofficial. Escalation came after that. I noticed a car idling across from my apartment at night. I found my locker emptied. HR scheduled a wellness review. A hospital attorney asked me, off the record, whether I was under a lot of stress. The critical evidence surfaced by accident. I was clearing out my locker when I found a mislabeled flash drive taped behind the frame. I didn't recognize it, but it contained archived patient logs from before the system update. dozens of cases. Years back, different hospitals, different counties. Same physician signature, same line. Secondary protocol initiated. This wasn't new, it was mobile. The life-threatening moment wasn't violent. It was administrative. I was told my license was under review pending an investigation into professional conduct. I was advised to stop coming in until it was resolved. I took the flash drive to the state medical board and then to a federal health investigator whose name I found in a public report. They listened, they took copies, they didn't promise anything. Intervention came quietly. A week later, a joint task force arrived at the hospital after midnight. They sealed the morgue. They took servers. They interviewed staff individually. By morning, the hospital issued a statement about data irregularities. Aftermath stretched on. The hospital lost funding. Administrators resigned. A sealed case moved through federal court. Names were redacted. No charges were announced. The patients Dr. Caney had saved were never located. Death certificates were amended. Some people were declared missing. Others were quietly removed from records. I left nursing soon after. I don't work nights anymore. Sometimes, in crowded places, I catch a reflection that doesn't match the movement. A man in scrubs I don't recognize. Always calm, always precise, and always watching. The company town. I was working as an investigative journalist in 2014, focusing on labor violations in the Appalachian coal industry. At the time, my work was routine. I followed tips, filed public records requests, interviewed former miners, and wrote reports that rarely led to consequences. Most stories ended the same way. Minor fines, corporate statements, no criminal charges. My days were structured and predictable. I worked out of a small apartment in Lexington, reviewed OSHA reports in the mornings, made calls in the afternoon, and drove out to sites when a lead justified the mileage. I had covered unsafe shafts, falsified inspections, and retaliatory firings. Nothing about the work felt dangerous. The industry was hostile, but the hostility was bureaucratic, not personal. The trigger that led me to Harlan Hollow came from a sealed workers' compensation claim I obtained through a source at the state labor office. The claim referenced repeated injuries at a single mine in eastern Kentucky, but the payout record showed no hospitalizations, no death benefits, and no surviving dependents. The employer listed was a subsidiary company I hadn't encountered before. The address traced back to a town called Harlan Hollow. I couldn't find much information about it. No website, no recent census data. The town appeared in tax filings as a residential support site, wholly owned by the mining corporation. That alone was enough to justify a visit. Harlan Hollow was 4 hours east of Lexington, past the last reliable cell coverage. The road narrowed as I approached, cutting through wooded hills and abandoned rail lines. There were no billboards, no gas stations, no visible signage until I reached a rusted metal sign partially obscured by vines. It read, Harlan Hollow, no population listed. The town itself was small. One main road. Identical houses built decades earlier. A general store, a church, a mine access road gated off at the far end. There was no internet service, no cellular signal. I noticed immediately that everyone I saw was wearing company-issued clothing. I checked into the only motel, a 2-story structure with sagging balconies and stained carpet. The clerk didn't ask for identification. He didn't offer a receipt. He just wrote my name in a ledger and handed me a key. That first afternoon, I tried to speak with residents. I introduced myself as a journalist investigating mine safety. Every person I approached gave the same response. "We're fine. The company takes care of us." They said it calmly, flatly, no variation. That evening, I reviewed publicly available accident reports from the mine. There were dozens of recorded incidents, collapses, toxic exposure, missing workers. The reports ended abruptly. No follow-ups, no recovered remains, no family notifications listed. Around midnight, I heard singing. It wasn't loud, but it was coordinated. Dozens of voices, carrying through the valley. I stepped outside the motel. The sound was coming from the direction of the mine. I followed it on foot. The mine entrance was illuminated by floodlights. A large group of workers stood outside the gate. They were swaying slightly, singing a hymn I didn't recognize. Their faces were blank. No one spoke. When the singing stopped, they walked forward together and entered the mine. I moved closer, but a security guard stepped into my path. He was armed, wearing company insignia. "You don't want to go in there," he said. I asked why. "Because they don't come back out," he replied. The next morning, I requested a formal interview with the mine manager. He agreed immediately. He was cordial, confident, and well-prepared. He denied all allegations of unsafe conditions and dismissed the accident reports as clerical errors. When I asked about missing workers, he smiled and said, "We take care of our people." He offered me a tour. I declined at first. Then I accepted, knowing I wouldn't get another opportunity. Before entering the mine, I left my phone recording in my jacket pocket. There was no signal, but the audio would still capture locally. We went deep underground, past operational areas, past warning signs. The air grew hotter, thicker. The manager spoke casually, explaining production quotas and labor efficiency. We reached a sealed chamber. Inside were workers, hundreds of them, alive, emaciated, restrained by chains anchored into the rock. Their eyes followed us, but they didn't speak. I understood then what Harlan Hollow was. A closed labor system. Workers brought in, isolated, stripped of external contact, and worked until they couldn't continue. Deaths were recorded as accidents. Bodies were never recovered because they were never removed. The manager noticed my reaction. His tone changed. He told me the company had agreements with state officials. He said enforcement agencies were aware and that exposure would create problems for people who didn't belong there. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. I remember reaching the surface and not stopping until I was miles down the road. Back in Lexington, I contacted the FBI. I submitted my recordings, notes, photographs of internal documents I'd copied during the tour. At first, there was hesitation, jurisdictional questions, delays. Then, someone listened to the audio. A week later, federal agents raided Harlan Hollow. What they found exceeded my report. Human trafficking, forced labor, mass graves concealed near collapsed shafts, dozens of complicit officials named in internal correspondence. 53 people were arrested. The mine was shut down. The town was evacuated. The legal proceedings took years. Some charges were reduced. Some defendants disappeared into plea agreements. The corporation dissolved its subsidiary and rebranded. Harlan Hollow no longer appears on maps. But I still have the audio. Sometimes, late at night, I replay it. Beneath the manager's voice, beneath my breathing, there's something else. Singing. It doesn't stop when the recording ends. The frequency. I was a radio technician by trade, not a broadcaster, not a personality. I fixed transmitters. I kept signals clean. That was my job. I lived alone outside a small town in rural Oregon, about an hour from the coast, surrounded by logging roads and abandoned silos. My days were predictable. Wake up early, check weather reports, drive to whichever relay station needed inspection, replace parts, log readings, go home. The AM station I worked for operated on a narrow budget. Local news, high school sports, farm reports, the kind of station no one paid attention to unless something went wrong. I liked that. The work was quiet. Signals behaved according to rules. Interference had causes. You found them, you fixed them. The trigger event came in June of 2015. We started receiving intermittent interference on 820 kHz. That frequency wasn't assigned to anyone in the region. At first, it was faint. Static bursts, irregular. I logged it as atmospheric noise. Then it began to repeat. The arrival of the problem wasn't dramatic. It didn't spike meters or trip alarms. It crept in during late hours, when the station was mostly automated. The noise gained structure, patterns, cadence. I listened longer than I should have. Under the static, there were voices. Not a broadcast, no call sign, no modulation pattern I recognized, just overlapping fragments, like several conversations bleeding into each other. Some were in English, some weren't. I recorded samples and ran spectrum analysis. The signal origin didn't match any licensed transmitter. I filed a report with the FCC. That's procedure. They sent an inspector. He ran tests. He found nothing. He told me interference like that happens. He closed the case. The interference continued. I work nights often, fewer variables, fewer interruptions. One night, alone in the station, I heard it clearly for the first time. No static, no distortion. Individual words cut through. Help us. We're still here. They won't let us leave. I shut the receiver down, restarted it. The voices returned immediately, calm, repetitive, not panicked, like rehearsed lines. I began tracing the signal manually. Directional antennas, old methods. The bearing pointed north. Consistently. 30 miles out, beyond the last town, past logging land and into federal property that hadn't been used in decades. Fort Crow. It was a decommissioned military installation, closed in 1968. According to public records, it had been dismantled and left to decay. No active infrastructure, no power allocation, no transmitters. I drove out there the next morning. The location was isolated, the road narrowed. Pavement gave way to gravel. No signage, no cell service. The gate was chained and posted with warning signs that had faded beyond legibility. I climbed the fence. Inside, the base was what you'd expect. Collapsed barracks, rusted vehicles, debris overtaken by moss. No signs of recent human presence, except the tower. It stood in the center of the compound. Intact, recently maintained. Power lines ran to it, buried, still live. I could hear the hum before I reached it. This was the first moment I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, just the absence of ambient sound. No birds, no wind, the kind of quiet that feels managed. I climbed the tower. At the top, mounted to the platform, was a transmitter. Active, calibrated, and next to it, protected by a weathered metal case, was a reel-to-reel tape player. It was running. The tape was labeled in block letters, Project Mindfield, 1967. I took it. Back home, I played it once. I didn't make it all the way through. The tape contained recordings of human voices, not radio chatter, not interviews, screaming, begging, repeating phrases over and over. Some voices broke down mid-sentence and restarted, as if conditioned to repeat. I stopped the tape. I sealed it. I documented everything. Pattern recognition came next. I searched military archives, freedom of information requests. Most were denied or returned heavily redacted, but I found references. psychological warfare research, sensory manipulation, experiments involving prolonged exposure to audio stimuli. Fort Crow appeared repeatedly, always under different departmental names. Oversight shifted, responsibility blurred. I contacted a historian who specialized in Cold War-era black sites. He confirmed what the record suggested. Fort Crow had housed a classified program involving prisoners, POWs, political dissidents, individuals who officially disappeared. The goal was to weaponize radio frequencies, implant thoughts, break resistance, control behavior. The program was shut down, officially terminated. Equipment was supposed to be dismantled, but the transmitter was never turned off. The first hard evidence I turned over was the tape. The second was signal data. The third was photographic proof of the active tower. I submitted everything to the FCC and the Department of Defense. Institutional resistance followed. Calls went unanswered. Emails stalled. I was told the site was historical and outside active jurisdiction. One official suggested I had misinterpreted the recordings. Then I noticed a vehicle parked near my house at night. No plates, engine running. It left when I stepped outside. The escalation was quiet. My work assignments were reduced. My access credentials were flagged. A representative from a federal agency visited me. He advised me to stop pursuing the matter for my own safety. The critical evidence discovery came unexpectedly. While reviewing the tape frame by frame, I found a segment that wasn't human voices. It was a control tone, a carrier frequency embedded beneath the audio. The same frequency as the interference we'd been receiving. The voices weren't residual, they were being broadcast. I destroyed the tape. That was my decision. I didn't trust any institution to handle it responsibly. Within weeks, the FCC shut down the tower. Officially, it was due to unauthorized transmission. No mention of content. No public explanation. Fort Crow was fenced off again. Increased security. No press. Aftermath was minimal. No arrests. No trials. No accountability. The project remained classified. But sometimes, late at night, when the air is still and the radio is on, I hear fragments. Not on 820 kHz, on empty frequencies. Whispers, familiar phrases. The transmitter is offline. But whatever was recorded there doesn't belong to the past. And no one has explained how long it was broadcasting before anyone noticed. The detour. I had been driving long-haul routes for almost 15 years by the fall of 2016. By then, my life ran on schedules and margins, federal hours of service rules, fuel stops timed to the minute. Logbooks kept clean because inspectors don't care about excuses. I drove the same corridors through the Midwest often enough that I could picture the exits before the signs came into view. Iowa was never a problem. Flat, predictable, quiet. You could lose focus there if you weren't careful, but you couldn't get lost. That night started like every other. I was hauling a refrigerated load eastbound, planning to cut through the state and stop just short of the Illinois line. Weather was clear, traffic was thin. AM radio fading in and out like it always does once you get away from cities. I wasn't tired, I wasn't rushing. There was no reason for anything to go wrong. The detour sign appeared just after midnight. It wasn't reflective like the official ones. Just plywood, hand-painted letters, road closed, follow arrows. 3 orange arrows nailed beneath it, pointing off onto a county road I didn't recognize. There were cones, enough to look legitimate. I slowed, checked my map display. The GPS recalculated without protest. I followed. At first, it made sense. 1-lane road, cornfields on both sides, no houses, no yard lights, just the sweep of my headlights and the white line pulling me forward. I expected to loop back to the highway within 10 minutes. Then 20 passed, then 40. The arrows kept appearing at intersections, always turning me deeper into the grid. My GPS stopped updating. The screen froze, then went blank. My phone lost signal at the same time. That wasn't unusual by itself, but together it put me on edge. I checked the clock. Just after 1 a.m., I told myself I'd missed a junction and kept going. An hour later, I knew I was lost. That was when I saw the lights. They came up over a slight rise. An entire town lit like a postcard. Street lamps evenly spaced, storefronts glowing. A main street straight out of the mid-20th century. Neon signs, clean sidewalks, people walking in small groups. No cars moving, no traffic noise, just stillness wrapped in light. I pulled to the shoulder and shut down the engine. The silence pressed in immediately. No insects, no wind through the fields. Even the hum of electricity felt absent. I stepped down from the cab, my boots loud against the pavement, and that was when I noticed the people watching me. They were smiling. All of them. Not exaggerated, not cartoonish, just fixed, like they'd been waiting. A man in a jacket tipped his head as I passed. A couple held hands and didn't break stride. No one spoke. I went into the diner because it was the only place that felt familiar. Bell over the door, counter, vinyl booths. The smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. The waitress didn't ask what I wanted. She poured a mug and slid it across the counter before I sat down. "You're right on time," she said. "For what?" I asked. She smiled wider. "The choosing." That was the first time I felt real fear, not panic, just a clear understanding that I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I left the coffee untouched and walked out. No one tried to stop me. No one followed. I got back in the truck and drove. Every road led back to the same street. I tried different turns, side roads, what looked like a service lane behind a hardware store that shouldn't have been open at that hour. Each time, the buildings fell away, the lights thinned, and then I'd crest a rise and see the same main street ahead of me. Same people, same smiles. The clock on my dash stopped advancing. On the third loop, a man stood in the road. He didn't raise his hands. Didn't signal me to stop. He just stood there, calm, certain I'd brake. I did. "You have to choose," he said through the open window. "Choose what?" "To stay or to forget." I asked him who he was. He didn't answer. I asked where I was. He shook his head, still smiling, like I'd missed something obvious. Cars didn't pass, no doors opened. The town held its breath. I closed my eyes, I don't know why, instinct. Maybe. I said, out loud, "I choose to leave." When I opened them, I was back on the highway. My truck was idling on the shoulder. No lights behind me, no town ahead, just cornfields and a clean stretch of road. The detour sign was gone. My GPS came back on, recalculating like nothing had happened. The clock jumped forward. 6 hours were missing. I drove straight to the nearest state police station. I told them everything, the detour, the town, the lost time. They listened politely, took my information and checked their system. No road closures, no detours authorized or reported. No town matching my description within 100 miles. No missing truckers reported on that route. They suggested fatigue. I wasn't satisfied. I pulled my logbook. The electronic record showed a gap. 6 hours unaccounted for. That should have triggered an automatic review. It didn't. The entry was marked as signal interruption, approved by a supervisor code I didn't recognize. I filed a report anyway. Followed up with the Department of Transportation. Requested records of any temporary traffic control permits issued in that county. I got nothing back. Weeks passed, then months. When I called, I was told the files didn't exist. I started asking other drivers, quietly. At truck stops, late at night. Most laughed it off. A few went still. One man from Nebraska told me he'd lost time in Iowa, too. Said he woke up parked on an on-ramp with no memory of how he got there. His logbook had been corrected. That was when I realized it wasn't just me. I requested my own employment file from my carrier. Portions were missing. A safety review dated 2 days after my incident referenced an off-route anomaly that had been resolved internally, signed by a compliance officer who no longer worked there. No forwarding information. I pushed harder. That was a mistake. I noticed cars behind me that stayed too long. A state inspector who pulled me over twice in 1 week for equipment checks that turned up nothing. A voicemail with no voice, just open air, left at 2:30 a.m. I stopped calling agencies after a man from the DOT suggested, off the record, that I let sleeping roads lie. There was one piece of evidence I couldn't explain away. My truck's engine control module logged idle time during the missing hours. Location data showed me stationary, coordinates unresolved. Not moving, not anywhere. Eventually, I was contacted by a federal task force reviewing irregularities in commercial transport logs across several states. They asked about Iowa, about detours that weren't authorized, about gaps approved without oversight. I gave them everything. Copies, statements, names. Then the contact stopped. The task force was disbanded the following year due to budget realignment. No findings released, no hearings. The detours never appeared on official maps. The counties involved denied any knowledge. A few local road supervisors retired early. I still drive. I keep to major routes. I ignore handwritten signs. If a road closes, I wait it out. Sometimes late at night I see lights off in the distance where there shouldn't be any. Perfect rows. Too even to be farmhouses. I don't slow down. My logbooks stay clean now. No gaps, no anomalies. But I know there are roads in Iowa that don't lead where they're supposed to, and I know that somewhere out there, there's a town that doesn't need permission to exist, just someone willing to choose. The Pale Road. I was a state trooper assigned to patrol the back roads of the Mississippi Delta. My beats were long, sparsely populated stretches that ran through farmland, swampland, and clusters of hardwood forest. Most days, the work was quiet. Speeding tickets, stranded motorists, occasional minor accidents. I lived alone in a small mobile home just outside Greenwood. My routines were methodical: morning roll call, equipment check, patrol runs from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., logging mileage and incidents. Nights were usually empty, the roads silent, lit only by moonlight and the occasional porch light. I liked the isolation. It made life predictable. The first reports came in during the winter of 2017. Drivers called in to report a road they didn't recognize near the western edges of my patrol zone. According to them, the pavement was pale, almost luminous, and it appeared only at night. GPS units didn't record it. Maps didn't show it. Some drivers claimed they turned onto it by accident and were gone for hours, only to find themselves back on familiar roads with no memory of the detour. I filed it off as anecdotal. Locals sometimes tell stories, exaggerating travel conditions or confusing rural back roads with each other. But then the calls became consistent. The trigger event occurred on a cold January night. I was responding to a minor traffic complaint near a logging route when I drove past a turnoff I had never noticed before. The air was still, the fog thick over the low-lying fields. As I approached, the asphalt glimmered faintly in my headlights. It was pale, unnaturally white, and seemed to stretch into the darkness between the trees. My first thought was reflection, frost, some optical illusion. But the surface remained luminous even as I slowed to examine it. Curiosity, combined with professional responsibility, pushed me to follow it. I radioed dispatch to inform them of my location and direction. The road extended far beyond what I could see, straight and unbroken, lined with trees, but without signs, lights, or markings of any kind. The asphalt was smooth, perfectly maintained, with no cracks or debris, a stark contrast to the deteriorating county roads I knew. My radio lost signal entirely. The sense of isolation was immediate. As I continued, I began to notice early irregularities. The air grew unnaturally still. No wind, no animal sounds, no insects. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but nothing moved beyond the tree line. I passed a mailbox, the numbers indecipherable, the house behind it obscured. I saw no smoke from chimneys, no glimmer of electricity from windows. There were no tire tracks besides my own. It became evident that this road existed in a way that didn't conform to local geography or infrastructure. By the 5th mile, I began to see a pattern. Abandoned vehicles appeared at intervals, sedans, trucks, SUVs, all of them in good condition, doors open, engines occasionally still running. I counted at least a dozen before I stopped to inspect one. The interiors were intact, wallets, purses, phones, coats, no bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate why the vehicles had been abandoned. The VINs were readable, so I traced them in the missing persons database once I returned to signal range. Each car corresponded to a reported missing person. Some cases dating back 5 years, others more recent. There was no exception. I photographed the vehicles and recorded their positions. It was hard evidence, but not something I could immediately process. I contacted my supervisor and requested backup. Local deputies joined me a few hours later, but as dawn approached, the pale road vanished. From where I rejoined the main route, there was only empty field, swamp, and trees. No pavement, no tire marks, no abandoned vehicles. Institutional resistance emerged quickly. When I filed my report, the State Highway Department denied any knowledge of a pale road in that area. The Missing Persons Division classified my findings as unverified reports. Requests for aerial imagery or satellite data yielded nothing. My supervisor cautioned me to avoid discussing the matter outside official channels, citing potential media panic. Requests to trace the exact locations of abandoned vehicles were delayed or denied. Despite this, I persisted, collecting witness statements from drivers who reported similar sightings over the previous 3 years. Escalation into personal danger followed shortly thereafter. One evening, while conducting follow-up patrols near the reported area, I noticed a black SUV parked along the roadside. It wasn't moving. As I passed, the vehicle followed me, maintaining distance but never overtaking. I radioed dispatch and attempted to take note of the license plate, but as soon as I turned toward the driveway of my residence, the vehicle was gone. A week later, another trooper reported a similar encounter near the same location. It became clear that someone, or something, was monitoring activity connected to the road. The critical evidence arrived in the form of a GPS data download from my patrol vehicle. It showed a continuous deviation from all mapped roads for over 12 miles, precisely corresponding to the pale road. This data, coupled with the photographic record of the abandoned vehicles, formed a coherent record of the anomaly. Federal transportation investigators later retrieved the evidence from my custody and confirmed the existence of uncharted paved roads in remote Mississippi, coinciding with multiple unresolved missing persons reports. The life-threatening confrontation never came in the form of direct violence, but it manifested through the persistent sense of being observed and the knowledge that anyone pursuing these cases too closely encountered obfuscation or silent intimidation. My communications were occasionally intercepted, GPS signals altered, files I submitted disappeared from internal servers. It became apparent that certain authority figures were complicit, whether in concealing records or blocking investigative leads. Federal intervention followed. A limited task force examined the sites where vehicles had been abandoned and surveyed the surrounding woods for evidence. They recovered additional cars, all corresponding to cold missing persons cases but no bodies. Legal proceedings were minimal. Agencies closed their files citing insufficient evidence for prosecution, and some officials involved in the obstruction were quietly reassigned. Locals were advised to report any anomalous roads or sightings, but received no details beyond general safety warnings. The aftermath left a lingering dread. I retired from active patrol duties soon after. Every time I drive rural roads at night, I remain hyper-aware of mile markers and unexpected turnoffs. Witnesses continue to report seeing pale asphalt stretching into darkness, yet no road crews or authorities can confirm its existence. Vehicles continue to vanish. Personal effects reappear in unlikely places, sometimes decades later. Sometimes, late at night, I see a faint glow in my rearview mirror while driving familiar routes. I know better than to turn onto it. But the knowledge that the road exists, the evidence, the cars, the missing people, remains with me. The pale road is not a place on any map. It is a conduit, a hidden crime, and a continuing threat. Some roads, I have learned, do not lead anywhere. They simply take.